At TCS, we deeply believe that travel makes the world better, but right now, staying at home is making the world better. We are all facing times beyond compare, but we are all doing our part for ourselves and for others by staying home. This is both a small thing and a huge thing. It's important and essential, and it's making a difference in the world. We at TCS are staying home too. Although our travels are on hold for now, our vision of the world will never change. Our world is large. Our world is full of wonder. Our world is transformative and meant to be experienced and shared. And when the time is right for you to travel again, we will be here. Our office team, our expedition leaders, our experts, our local guides, and our friends across the globe will be ready and waiting, ready to take you to the far corners of the globe, ready to anticipate your every need, ready to connect you with the people and places that bring meaning, joy, and greater understanding to our lives. We will be here for you to once again make the world a better place through travel.
Good afternoon, and welcome to TCS World Travel's Discovery Series live event. It's our pleasure today to present world-renowned U.S. National Parks expert, Dr. Stephen Cunha. Stephen will be in conversation with TCS's own enrichment manager, Jess Seppi. They have a wonderful program planned for us today. My name is Susie Lukacs. I'm a Director of Business Development at TCS, and I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items with you before we get started. First, turn the volume all the way up on whatever device you're listening to us on. Your audio will be muted throughout the broadcast, but you can contact us in real time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Simply type in your question, submit it, and we will see it in real time. It'll be private only to the TCS staff, but we will try and answer everyone's questions during the broadcast. If we're unable to, rest assured we will respond to everyone by email. You can enlarge any of the screens on your platform by clicking the small icon on the upper right side of each box, and you can bring them back to their original size by clicking the arrow that you'll see on the left of the Q&A button. We have two file tabs to the right of the Q&A button. And the file tabs, the first one's titled Resources, and that has a wealth of information in there about the national parks and about our journeys to the parks. So please do look in there and enjoy and download. All the items in there are downloadable. And to the right of that, we have a speaker bio where you can learn some more information about Dr. Cunha. We'll be sending out 3 quick polling questions during the webcast today. They're very brief, but they really do help inform us as we plan our journeys in the future. We're going to put the first one out now so you can see it. Have you ever traveled with TCS or one of our partners before? Yes or no? Click submit. Well done. I see the answers coming in already. Thank you so much. There'll be 2 more throughout the webcast, equally short. So thank you so much for participating with that. So without further ado, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jess Seppi. Jess is the enrichment manager at TCS, and she's responsible for all the rich content, cultural and educational content that you experience when you travel with TCS. If you have traveled with TCS, you have benefited from her immense contributions. So it's over to you, Jess.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Susie. So as Susie mentioned, I manage the enrichment side of our programming, and one aspect of that is working with remarkable experts to curate relevant and engaging content around our destinations. So I was particularly excited to hear about our newest trips highlighting the national parks. To help us learn a bit more about the national parks, I've brought in one of these remarkable experts to share his insights with us today. We are lucky to be joined by geographer, educator, and author, Dr. Stephen Cunha. Stephen spent 10 years as a park ranger in Yosemite in Alaska, Recently retired as a geography professor at Humboldt State University, he often travels to and lectures on US and Canadian national parks on private jet expeditions. He spent 4 years developing the Palmyra National Park in eastern Tajikistan, which was named the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2013. So welcome, Stephen, and thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to advance into a little bit of history of how the parks came about. And it's a really interesting story because when most people think of national parks in the first one, they think of Yellowstone, as well they should. But before Yellowstone, there was Yosemite. And that's where the idea that changed the world began, because Yosemite was actually the first codified park in the world, meaning it would pass legislative approval and was signed by a chief executive or president or prime minister or king. And in 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln was presented with a bill that was introduced to the Senate initially by John Cunha, for which there's a big peak in Yosemite named after him. And it was to grant federal land, which was Yosemite Valley and an adjacent grove of giant sequoias, to the state of California for a park, to be held inalienable for all time, to not be a place where we might go in and mine and log, perhaps put a dam in or grow crops. And you can imagine Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War seeing this bill for a park way across the country in California. And as far as we know, with almost no great deliberation, he signed it. And the world had its first codified state park. Now, this again was a state park because the state of California ran it. And it was the 7 square miles of Yosemite Valley and then a nearby adjacent grove of giant sequoias. These paintings are by Albert Bierstadt, and he was a painter of the Hudson School of Style, which many of you may know, but he went to Yosemite. And this was thought to be really necessary because the people in the East, where most of the population lived, had absolutely no way to comprehend trees that were larger than most homes, and a valley where there were so many waterfalls, 2, 3, 4, and even 7 times the height of Niagara. And these paintings helped bring it to life. And very quickly, Congress allocated the valley and the big trees to the state of California, and we had our first park. So when you go to Yosemite, it's more than just a valley. It's also the birth of a great idea that has now gone to over 200 countries around the world. This was really the beginning of the movement for parks and protected areas for non-utilitarian purposes. Meanwhile, people had started going into the Yellowstone region. And about 6 years later, there were these fantastic reports coming into Washington, D.C. about a land filled with geysers and boiling hot springs and wildlife and raging rivers and, again, big mountains. Now, the wildlife wasn't that exciting to most Easterners because they were accompanied, they were used to wildlife. There was still a lot of wildlife in the East, and of course they knew the plains were still filled with buffalo, unlike today. But it was these thermal features that were so interesting and intriguing, so much so that the federal government dispatched the Hayden Survey to check out Yellowstone and see if they were actually being honest. Because, early writers, even today, some travel writers, are prone to exaggeration a little bit. And sure enough, what they found was over half the world's thermal features in this one small area, which we now know as Yellowstone. They also brought a painter, in this case, Thomas Moran, who painted this gigantic gash that we know of as the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone with its wonderful colored rhyolitic rock. In fact, if I could just turn that waterfall on, that's almost exactly what it looks like. His color rendition was perfect. It would do any photographer proud. But again, this waterfall is much higher and the volume is greater than even Niagara, which is really the only waterfall the Easterners had to comprehend the size of this. And it was so interesting, in part because, again, it was over half the world's thermal features. Well, they didn't know that at the time, but they were in a giant caldera. And for those of you that have been to Yellowstone, you might not know, and I'm going to color this up. That's the Yellowstone Caldera, the heart of the park. More volcanic lava and ash came flying out of that caldera, which moved around. The center of it moved within that shaded area in 3 eruptions. They're so-called 3 super eruptions. They're the largest super eruptions in world history. So if you look at the top 10, Yellowstone had 3 of them. That's the biggest volcanic area on the planet. And if you go there in Yellowstone, you might be lucky enough to feel a little seismic activity. That is magma still underneath Yellowstone. And if it shakes too much, I'd get in your car and get out of there. But the reality, of course, if it blows when you're there and becomes one of the top 3 or 4 big eruptions, that absolutely dwarf Mount St. Helens, which most of us remember because it's during our time. If it blows, you may end up as far east as Minnesota or all the way to Seattle, where TCS, I think, is headquartered. It sent ash that far. So when you're in Yellowstone, you're in this place of not just, the birth of the national park idea, which followed. We'll get to that in just a second. But you're in the greatest volcanic zone on the planet. More lava came out of there than anywhere else. And again, it's most of our thermal features. And you see this when you go to the Grand Prismatic Spring. There are hundreds and hundreds of thermal features in Yellowstone. And some of them are still being discovered because new ones bubble up all the time, which is an interesting thing about Yellowstone. Maybe we'll get another Old Faithful. This is the Morning Glory, which is a clear pool of boiling hot water. Well, the people that went on the second Hayden expedition, the year after the first one, with the painter, also brought Thomas Moran along a second time, and they decided this needs to be a park like Yosemite. Let's make it a state park. But of course, in 1872, there was no park. There was no state there. There was no Wyoming or Montana. So they came up with the idea of a nation's park for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And this became the world's first national park. So Yosemite was the world's first park, and it was a state park. Yellowstone, by default, became a national park. Later, Yosemite was enlarged and became a national park, as we know. There are other landscapes that helped stir the national park idea. And this one actually came from a scientist who really wasn't advocating for national parks. He was more advocating for wiser irrigation use in the arid West. And this, of course, was John Wesley Powell and his discovery of a lot of the geology and his first trip down the Grand Canyon. As far as you know, no Native American had ever gone down the Grand Canyon. And Powell, who wrote a marvelous account of this, which became a U.S. Geological Survey professional paper, which you can read today online, talks about the scariest part, going through the heart of the Grand Canyon, which is the marble and granite gorges. And you're looking at it right there from up above. I'm on the inner part of the Grand Canyon, right above the Colorado River itself. And before Powell went down there, this is what he wrote. We have an unknown distance to run, an unknown river to explore. What falls there are, we know not. What rocks beset the channel, we know not. What walls ride over the river, we know not. Ah, well, we may conjecture anything. And he goes on to talk about how the men bantered about with jokes and how everybody was, filled with good humor and good spirits, but they were all scared to death. And,
well, I love this too, because, when we talk about the national parks, and it's clear why these places are so significant, explorers and artists played such an important role in the establishment and, popularization of these parks. And I love how we've talked a lot about him. And, you talk about we have an unknown distance to run, an unknown river to explore. And he's doing all of this with one arm, in wooden boats through.
He lost an arm in the Battle of Shiloh. He was a Civil War vet. And I have been
more about these artists and explorers. They paint such an interesting story to the whole park system.
Without them, the Easterners wouldn't have known about these parks to any degree at all, except maybe some odd writings. But what happened was the pictures, and Powell had a camera, but of course in Yellowstone and Yosemite they didn't. And so it was the painters that brought these places to life. And there were always these disbelievers. He said, no, it's just hyperbole. Westerners thinking they have the best. And then someone from the East, from the Senate or the Congress, would go out and they'd come back and their head had exploded. And they said, yes, it's all true. And so what really happened, and when it really took off, was when John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt met in Yosemite. Now, there's an interesting story here, because Muir had come over the 4 years after Yosemite became a state park, so a few years before Yellowstone became a national park. And he got off a steamer in San Francisco and said, they said, where do you want to go? And he said, anywhere that's wild. And they sent him to this new park. And he actually got a job herding sheep and took them up and over the top of the park and back. And then he started writing and became really well known as a scientist and a literary scholar. But Roosevelt wrote him in 1903 and said, I'd like to come camp out with you and find out what this is all about. And Muir wrote back and said, sorry, I have plans to go to Japan. And his friends were horrified. They said, are you crazy? The president wants to come camp with you and talk to you. So he wrote back and said, yeah, come on out. And they camped for 3 nights, including one night here at Glacier Point. You're looking at Yellowstone or Yosemite Falls from the top of Glacier Point there. They camped there 3 nights, and 2 of the world's and the nation's most loquacious figures, Roosevelt and Muir, talked all night long, and we don't have a word of it. We don't know what they talked about. But Roosevelt went back to Washington, started the National Forest Service, and greatly expanded the National Park Service, the National Park System, including one of his prized jewels. His first ones was creating a national monument of Grand Canyon based on Powell's writings. So yeah, they were fundamental. And then came along Ansel Adams, and he was commissioned in the 1940s to go look around the West and the East and to take photographs that would go to the House and the Senate to help promote new national parks. And so again, he wasn't a painter, but he took a different medium, the new medium of photography. And his photographs were very influential in establishing new parks and enlarging others and protecting others. Yellowstone is the most intact temperate ecosystem we have on the planet. And a lot of that is because of the photographs and the paintings and the scientific reports that came out that showed it was significant. And certainly by the time Roosevelt was in the White House, the buffalo herds had largely disappeared. And we were starting to realize that the wildlife is really as important in the parks as were the thermal features in the Great Mountains too. So all of that happened, as you said, it's a mix of politicians, of scientists, and of artists that gave us the system that we have today. And it really expanded quickly. One second here, I've got to advance this. There we are. We added the Grand Teton Park. That was a result really of the Rockefellers who bought up the land secretly and then donated it to the Park Service and created now what we call the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We realize that Yellowstone, as large as it is, it really could be even a bigger park, and it needs to be bigger. And so with Yellowstone and the Grand Teton Park as the core, we're working with ranchers and homeowners in small communities to do things like take down their fences in the winter to allow the elk to migrate. And the historic elk migration in the Rocky Mountains is being returned. And it's interesting, the ranchers that often are opposed to any type of park or conservation work, if it impinges on their land, are very supportive of it. Because by then their cattle are finished for the year, the sheep are finished, and they have hundreds of elk migrating to their property, and they love it, just like we all do as well.
Oh,
and so the system expanded. Yeah. I just run to a few more. The Southwest is so unusual because in the Zagros of Iran or in Petra, you have these sandstone canyons, but nowhere on earth do you have the expansive region that we have in the Southwest, where these rivers have cut, like the San Juan and the Colorado, have cut through layers of sandstone, like butter through a knife through hot butter. Arches, which is unusual in its own right, the greatest concentration of natural arches in the world, cut by wind, not by water. And then Bryce Canyon, which is not a canyon at all. It's a misnomer. It's a break in a cliff that's eroded back. And while it's created hundreds of little canyons, it really isn't. So that is interesting in its own regard. And then let's just go to the newest parks, because most of them are up in Alaska. Now we have added some ones after the 1980 big park expansion bill that Jimmy Carter signed. But when the Alaskan parks came in, it added another third to the system. Some parks like Denali, shown here, were already national monument declared in 1916, but Denali became a national park in the 1980s, and it greatly expanded the area. And what's so incredible about this is even if you've never been there, you get a chance to see some of the greatest natural forces on the planet, because Denali is a great tectonic collision that squeezed up this mountain. It's like a stake driven into the heart of Alaska, but it really wasn't driven in, it rose out. And the mountain you're looking at is 17,000 feet from a 3,000 foot river plain. That goes straight up. It's one of the largest vertical drops in the world. and then it's been heavily glaciated, and then it's this high latitude and high elevation that's created this unusual vegetation pattern. On one side of Denali, we have tundra and permafrost. On the other side, we have some near Arctic forest, boreal forest. So it's really a fascinating place. And if you want to see what Yosemite looked like, or the great glaciers that once covered most of Yellowstone, you go to Denali and either climb the mountain or take a plane flight. One of them is decidedly much more interesting and comfortable than the other. But that's the Great Gorge of the Ruth Glacier, and that is a Pleistocene-type glacier that we can still see today. And then, there's so many wonderful Alaskan parks. Katmai is another one, and Yukon Charlie. But Glacier Bay is one of my favorites, and again, that was one of my ranger posts for several years. And that's got this incredible combination of marine interest and wildlife. And so there are now 61 national parks, but more to the point, around the world, 200 countries have national parks and protected areas, and they all stem from the idea that began in Yosemite and Yellowstone. And now we have about 4 to 5% of the earth also covered in marine parks, and that's a growing area and a great places for environmental restoration. So when you go to our parks, take pride in that it was the world's first system. And it's spread. It's often been referred to, as the writer Wallace Stegner said, the best idea the Americans ever had. And I certainly feel that way. I live right outside the gate of Yosemite, and it's a special place. So That's just a quick introduction. Thank you.
No, that's fabulous. Thank you, Stephen. And I think you did such a great job really highlighting the otherworldly grandeur of these places. And the rocks of southern Utah and the photos of that Ansel Adams has taken, and these huge geologic monoliths that look the same in his photos as they look now, which I think is really a great thing to see. It's perfect.
So Ansel Adams is a special person to me because he lived in Yosemite when I was a ranger there. He was there for often a good part of the summer and the winter, and he could no longer really take photographs. His eyesight was dimming. And he spent a lot of time mentoring young people, young rangers like me and others. And I invited him to speak at UC Berkeley to my forestry department, and he came. And then later he invited me to his home in Carmel. But I wasn't the only one, although you feel special. But his wife told me, Virginia, that he was spending the last 10 years of his life encouraging and mentoring young people to go into conservation and to help protect the parks that he had worked so hard to help establish. He was really a fine man, in addition to being, of course, a great photographer.
That's a fabulous story. And I think you really hit on a good point there, that to know and to experience and to see these places is to really feel a sense of stewardship for them. I think, your time in Yosemite and Alaska, I can hear the way you speak of these places. And
yeah, it's just, wait right there, I'll get you something. I'm coming back. Does this look familiar?
It suits you well. I can see that it's within too at all times.
It's falling apart, but I think like people that serve in the military, you notice even if they only serve 2 or 3 years, once you've been a ranger or maybe a Marine or an Air Force pilot, you believe so much in the mission that the rest of your life you identify. And I still identify with the Park Service, and I feel incredibly fortunate to have had this lifelong dream and a childhood dream of being a ranger and then being able to fulfill it. But I get to still work in the parks because I do research and I take groups in, and then I'm in them myself. So it's fun.
That's fabulous. And they're such special places, to see. One of the things that really moves me is seeing the wildlife and seeing it in its natural habitat, seeing animals coexisting together. And, it's akin to when you're in Tanzania and you see the wildlife, and it's really special. I think that's a really unique thing.
Let me make a point on that, because you just hit on it. If you're in Yellowstone, now with the return of the wolves, you could have been there with the Nez Perce or the Shoshone or other native tribes, or even before them, and the same wildlife was there. Yellowstone is a complete ecosystem, and if you go to the Serengeti, there are fewer rhinos than hunting dogs. but those species that are in the Serengeti have been there for millennia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's remarkable given that we have almost 8 billion people on the planet. We've been able to keep those areas intact. And one of them is in the heart of North America. It still makes my head spin sometimes, and also makes me very.
Well, and I think it's, seeing that, the landscape and the creatures and, everything around you. But another really special part about these parks, and not every park, but quite a few in the US, are these certified dark skies, and seeing stars and the Milky Way galaxy, and seeing the vastness that comes from that level of isolation.
Well, my wife and I have just spent the better part of 30 days on and off in Sequoia Kings National Park up in the high country, and also in Yosemite. And when the moon is down, now we're finishing the phase, without California, has largely been shut down, and we don't have the agriculture, and we don't have the dust that often floats up into the sky. And we've had brilliant weather with no moisture. The skies are unbelievable. I've seen Milky Way displays that I can't remember seeing even as a child. Yeah, and so the national parks are on this idea too of dark skies, and they're trying to get local communities to shut off their lights as much as they can at night. And it's a wonderful resource that really is something that we've really talked about the last decade.
Yeah, it's really
fabulous. If you see a dark sky and you see the Milky Way, layers of Milky Way, in the middle of the night, you can't go to sleep. It's so fascinating. Really. So
I completely get that.
I love the fact that we're getting to connect with other people. Do they have any questions?
Yeah, it looks like actually we got a couple questions sent in ahead of time when people registered. And then if folks want to continue pressing on that Q&A button below our faces, it looks like you can continue asking questions there. So I'll start with the questions that we have here, which is, the first one is, what park has been most impacted by climate change? Which is a good question.
Oh,
yeah.
Do I have a couple hours?
Yeah, start now. You're good.
Remember that this is a system of parks that goes from the Arctic clear to the tropics, the tropic latitude with Hawaiian and Virgin Islands. So I'm going to have to answer that. I'm going to have to give you several answers, okay, in terms of, because they've all been influenced by climate change. And any of you are farmers out there, that the weather's changing, the climate's changing slightly, temperatures and moisture. But I think if you go to the high latitudes, Denali and Kobuk National Parks have really been influenced because the permafrost is melting in places. Kobuk has lost some of that's up in the northwest Alaska. Okay, it's higher latitude even than Denali, and it borders the Bering Sea, and they're losing part of their shoreline because the permafrost is melting and then just falling into the ocean. So they even lost their ranger station to that. So that's a big change. The melting of the permafrost, the softening of it changes species. And, if you're an animal that relies on certain plants that grow in permafrost, then you have to shift your range. If you go into the mountain parks more in the lower 48 latitudes, I think the most dramatic example is Glacier National Park, which, the sad tale is it's going to be called Glacierless National Park, because within 30 to 50 years, if you've got kids or grandkids, by the time, they're old, there likely will be no glaciers in Glacier National Park. They're melting that quickly. And that's responding to, of course, a warmer summer and a bit longer summer. I think other parks like the Great Smokies and Shenandoah and even Acadia are noticing that as the climate warms, the winters are shorter and their winters a little warmer. And so they're undergoing range shift, which means that some of the species, the tree species, are moving north, or they're moving up in elevation. And this has even affected the maple syrup, business. They're moving all their operations further north. So those those parks are seeing changes in forest composition. And then, I have to say one more quick example. If you go all the way down to the Virgin Islands National Park, they're undergoing coral bleaching because of warming. Yeah. So they're all changing, just like your environment outside your door is changing. And it's imperceptible sometimes, but it's definitely. Remember that high latitude and high elevation areas and ocean areas change more quickly. They're like the canary in the coal mine, very sensitive to climate change.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I imagine they'll look different in 10 years from now and continue to change. The coral bleaching is really interesting because, as you know, you've been with us and, on trips to Australia and seeing the coral reefs there. And there's good news coming out of, certain parts of those. And hopefully the same can be said for ours.
Science may save the coral reef. Mm-hmm. Essentially planting coral reef like you might plant crops in your garden or in the Midwest. Heat resistant coral that, if left undisturbed, may well be able to regenerate and be able to withstand the bleaching events that have really damaged part of the reef. And I hate to be so direct about that, but it is damaged.
Yeah, no, completely. Well, I have a very tough question for you, and I'm very curious what you're going to say. What is an undiscovered gem in the park system?
I'll never tell.
It's with us.
I think, again, that depends on what your concept of a gem is. If you really love the desert.
My gem is the desert. I love the Southwest. I love a desert system.
All right. Well, a lot of those famous desert parks like Grand Canyon and Arches are very, very popular. So drive north to North and South Dakota. And there, we brought this name up before, is Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And it has 2 units, one in North Dakota in the southern part of the state and one in the northern part of South Dakota. So you can follow that direction. And it's a marvelous Badlands park. And then part of the Little Missouri River carves through the northern section. And it's absolutely magnificent and totally uncrowded. So I would, if you like deserts, I'd go to Theodore Roosevelt. If you like mountains, I would go to North Cascades in northern Washington. And that is a terrific mountain park with wonderful, easy and difficult hiking and mountain climbing and a wonderful drive across the North Cascades. Very uncrowded compared to Yosemite or Glacier. If you like plants, you have to go to where I lived for many years at Humboldt State University and go to Redwood National Park. Again, not crowded.
Yeah, gotta visit those banana slugs. I remember those.
Yeah, fantastic redwood trees, but also coastline that's eye-poppingly beautiful. Mm-hmm. And then if you like active earth processes, go to Hawaii volcanoes, because there the volcano is such that the lava just oozes out. And if it's active, you can actually walk right up to flowing lava. Now, it flows imperceptibly, or it might, if it's really moving along, go a couple feet every few minutes. But you can walk and see lava coming out of the earth. That's a rare thing to see. And don't worry, you will not get too close to it, because as you do, the heat is so intense, it repels you. Yeah, but it's a fantastic experience. And if it's pouring rain, definitely go, because as you get near the lava, you can feel your shirt getting pulled off you as the water evaporates, because the heat from the molten lava is so hot. Yeah, it's like a barrier. It's like glass that you can't bang through because it's a wall of heat. But it's very safe, and the rangers are always there. And so deserts, I go to Roosevelt. Mountains, I go to North Cascades. Plants, I go to Redwood. And active earth, I think you have to go to Hawaii volcanoes. And then when you're done, you can go to the beach.
That's a good idea. I think I should just start with that. Let's go with that. All right. Well, I think, let's see, I'm going to go to this question, which is, what is the best time of year to visit parks?
Again, it's an enormous system.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you want to,
but it looks like we lost him.
When you think about any park, think about the weather you can expect, and then the visitation. Because Yosemite Valley, this year it's largely shut down, but it gets the maximum visitation in August when the temperatures are in the high 90s and the waterfalls have extirpated. It's not the nicest time to be there. But of course, that's when the families vacation. A better time is the shoulder season. So I would think of latitude and altitude to determine what kind of access you'll get. For instance, Yellowstone and Glacier are largely closed down in the winter. I would think of the environment. Are you going to a mountain, a desert, or coast? And then think of the weather you expect and visitation. So either spend some time doing your homework, because the parks have gotten really popular, and they're very popular with international visitors too. And so you want to factor in visitation and the other things I mentioned, or go with someone who knows how to maneuver around the parks best and avoid the crowds, and then you can have a nice visit too. You have to do your homework now. It's not as easy as it used to be when we were all younger. And the parks are going upwards of 4 or 5 million visitors a year, and most of that is in the 3 summer months. So it's like trying to buy tickets to Hamilton. You got to plan ahead. You really do.
That's a good comparison. Very good. Wonderful. Well, I think we've got a great list of places to visit, really good things to think about, and this was phenomenal. I want to thank you so much, Stephen. It looks like we have a couple questions that are related to the national park trips themselves, which I might hop onto, but I want to thank you so much, Stephen. That was fabulous.
You're more than welcome. It's my favorite topic to talk about.
We'll have to follow up soon. I always have questions about the parks.
You bet.
Thank you, Stephen. Wonderful. Okay, so we have a few more questions related to some of the trips themselves. One of them, which makes complete sense, is what precautions will you be taking to keep us traveling safely on this trip? So if you pop into the resources, you can see some of the trips that have been created. One of the ways that we consider a great option is we can pick you up and drop you off by a private jet. This, we kind of limit the amount of travel that you are doing. The hotels that we're using and that we're proposing are operating at 50% capacity. So we're working directly with the hotels to ensure that their health and safety is in line with what we would expect and what our guests would expect. We're also happy to organize private lodging for guests, private homes, personal chefs, anything like that to kind of limit your, make the best experience for you. Another question is, can I adjust the itinerary? I just recently got back from Capitol Reef. I had a little, desert getaway. And I can say that if you haven't been there, you should go visit. So if you decided, I've been to Yellowstone quite a few times, maybe I want to spend more time in Canyonlands or more time in Grand Teton, all of these trips are, customizable. So anything that we have within our luxury custom travel program is, you think of it as a foundation. You're welcome to call our team and chat with them more about if you're interested in a little more of an adventurous trip, maybe a more relaxing vacation, a family vacation. We can arrange for babysitting. We can arrange for really anything that will make the trip what you want the trip to be. The other question we received, are there only 6 spots on the national park trip? What if it's just me and my partner? Or what if, and I imagine this is the same as what if it's a big group. So all of these trips are priced at 6 people, but it's for you. So you won't be paired up with another family. You won't be paired up with more folks. It would just be however many people you wanted on that trip. So everything is customizable. So feel free to click on those, the resources tab in the folder to learn more. So it looks like we didn't get to all the questions, but I want to make sure that we get back to Susie. So I want to thank you all for your great questions. I realize we may have missed a couple, but our team will definitely reach out, and I encourage you to reach out to our team here at TCS, the Luxury Custom Travel team, or any of our sales folks to learn more about our programs. Or if you have more questions about the national parks, Stephen has offered his expertise as well. For now, I'll pass it over to Susie to wrap it up for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. That was terrific. I have learned so much, and I cannot wait to get out to the national parks and explore. I can tell what my homework is going to be this weekend, enjoying looking through the different parks with my husband. So a special thanks to Stephen for his expertise and his time. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoy the information that you find in the resources tab. Our next event is going to be August 26th, and we are going to be exploring the hidden gems of the Hawaiian Islands. So please join us for that. And at the end of the broadcast, in just a minute, a survey will pop up. And it's very brief, but we really do appreciate your participation, as the survey questions really do help us as we formulate our upcoming journeys. So thank you again for joining us. Stay safe, be well, and have a wonderful weekend.